Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 10th session of the PWL International Seminar. As you know, this seminar is hosted by IFILNOVA at the Nova University of Lisbon in the context of the FCT-funded project Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life. Our guest today is Daniel Wyche, and I'm very pleased and honored to shortly introduce him to you. Daniel Wyche received his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School in 2020. His research focuses on the political content and consequences of philosophical notions such as spiritual exercises, the care of the self, philosophy as a form of life, or what may be generally called ethical practices of self-change. His first book, The Care of the Self and the Care of the Other, forthcoming from Columbia University Press, investigates the question of how, from what perspective, and under what conditions might forms of the care of the self be coterminous in practice with the care of the other, the care of the community and the care of the city. Alongside Nikki Clements, who is here with us today as well, Daniel is co-organizer of the Foucault and the Study of Religion seminar at the American Academy of Religion. Daniel has also been active as a musician, curator, and programmer with a number of organizations within the world of experimental and improvised music and related arts for over a decade, and especially interested in the relationship between improvisation and forms of philosophical life. Today, he's going to give a talk with the title, The Practice of Dignity, Martin Luther King Jr., Howard Thurman, and Political Self-Purification. Thank you so much, Daniel, for being here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so a few things. First off, I am so grateful to Marta and for all of you for being here for this conversation. This is something that the themes and the texts I want to talk about are something that come out of my book, but they also come out of my dissertation, which I did with Arnold Davidson a few years ago. So this is all, I feel like closely knit community, and I'm happy to be here. I'm really sorry I haven't been able to make some of the other seminars. It's just the time difference has been a bit of a challenge, but it's also very cool to have a genuinely international conversation, which maybe it's rarer for Americans, but it's really appreciated. So in terms of format, I'm going to try and be a good Hadotian and invoke a dialogue. I'm not going to, I will read something, but I want to kind of preface things a little more casually at first. And then the truth is I completely over prepared for this talk, so I have way too much stuff to talk about it. So I'm going to stop at a certain point and maybe we can just have a conversation, which I think would be hopefully more in the spirit of what we're talking about. So a few things. This section is a part of the research for my book, and it's a chapter on mostly on Martin Luther King Jr., who I think is, often, well, currently at least in certain areas, I think is undergoing a really exciting new kind of attention that I think he well deserves as a systematic thinker, and not just as someone who was a great activist and a great orator and a historical figure, but someone who genuinely had a very interesting and I think thorough command of the history of philosophy and brought that into his political work. And I think that that's very important. I can say some things about, I think, why I think there are political reasons why, at least here in the US, why someone like King has been publicly sanitized a little bit, unfortunately. And that's an interesting conversation in and of itself, especially when I think forms of life, right, are at stake here, and questions of justice and so on. But the talk is mostly going to focus on a mentor of King's, someone named Howard Thurman, who is, for many reasons, less well known here in the US and I think probably elsewhere as well, but it was a very, very interesting figure, kind of patron intellectual of the civil rights era in the US from the 1930s and on into, he died in the 80s, so for a very long time. And I want to preface all this, I'll kind of say a little bit more about who Thurman was, and I'll talk about King as well. But, I really over-prepared, so I'm going to just give the highlights and sort of reach into some of the major substance of some of the things I think are really interesting about Thurman as a thinker, and then we can hopefully have a conversation and it can go, really anywhere. But just to give a little bit of a preface here, my interest fundamentally, as Marta said, has to do with the question of the politics of spiritual exercises and or the care of the self, or even philosophy as a way of life, and how we might imagine philosophy as a form of political life in various ways. But so, I mean, the major question of my research and is basically what is the political content and what are the political consequences of spiritual exercises and the ethics of the care of the self, or even philosophy as a way of life, and how are forms of political life at once forms of philosophical life, at least potentially. How and this is, I think, the core question of my book in some sense. How and under what conditions is the ethical transformation of the self coterminous or identical or in dialogue with the political transformation of the material and political transformation of the world. And of course, what we mean by politics and so on, and also ethics has everything to do with this. And I think that there are some worries among a lot of the major thinkers in this area, and they're worries that I share, but I think that they're very generative places of ambiguity, even though I think they've been exploited by critics, I guess, let's just say. So first, I will begin with my favorite quote from our friend Michel Foucault. There is no first or final point of resistance to political power other than the relationship one has to oneself. And as I'm sure everybody here knows, this is from the Hermeneutics of the Subject. And on its own, this is a very ambiguous statement. Obviously, in the text, it comes in a context of talking about ancient Christianity and so on, but it does represent a more general principle. And I think it's very easy to misread this, at least for people who are less steeped in this material. Definitely for people who don't like Foucault, for example, this can be read as a kind of reductionism, right? A reduction of the political to simply the ethical. And, and I want to talk about that first before I start talking about King and Thurman. So, there are a few places, though, I think in Foucault's work and in others, in Hadot as well, excuse me, where some of these worries are articulated. So this is a massive quote, so I'm just going to read the bottom. And I think this is in dialogue with the statement that he just made and helps provide some context for it. Talking about the idea of just the language of the self, he says, as you know, all these injunctions to exalt oneself, to devote oneself to oneself, to turn in on oneself, to offer service to oneself, sound to our ears like a sort of challenge and defiance, desire for radical ethical change, a sort of moral dandyism, which is a term Hadot uses as well, and the assertion challenge of a fixed aesthetic and individual stage. Or else they sound to us like a somewhat melancholy and sad expression of the withdrawal of the individual who was unable to hold on to and keep firmly before his eyes in his grasp for himself a collective morality. That of the city-state, for example, who faced with the disintegration of this collective morality has nothing else to do but attend to himself. So we have the paradox of a precept of the care of the self, which signifies for us either egoism or withdrawal. And I think that one could read into Foucault's initial statement a form of egoism and withdrawal if one wanted to, but I don't think that's what's going on here. And another person who's a major figure in my book is George Friedman, the founder of the sociology of labor in France. And I've done a lot of work on his de la Sagesse and his Journal de Guerre, and I hope to translate those at some point. If I've been working on it for a while, but La Puissance is a very thick book for people who know. But he talks about this, the sagesse, the wisdom that is invoked in the title. And he says, the wisdom which is so necessary today is not a form of contemplation or retreat from the unrest and the abominations of the centuries. These are all my translations. So if, I get anything wrong, please let me know. And he says much later in the book, again, specifically talking about problems of technological change, but, political issues in general. Some, of course, have sensed the need to cultivate new spiritual forces in contemporary man, but very few among those are oriented in the only constructive direction. to search for these new forces in and through the recognition of the technological progress and action through what Jaspers calls a loyalty to the realities of the 20th century. Lacking that loyalty, the denunciation of the dangers of technological progress so often evolves into a mythical nostalgia for the past, which in turn leads, as the case may be, to a global rejection of modernity and a negative and desperate attitude. And this is the part I'm interested in. I mean, all of this, but an escape into spiritualism or mystical comforts and religious or secular forms of retreat from the world. So I think for both Foucault and Friedman, you have this worry about retreat, withdrawal, egoism, and so on. And so he also has this, Friedman has this other concept that I borrow heavily from and develop in my book as kind of a major theme and a major foil, which I call moralism. And this is what he says. I've indicated several of these grand problems, which today call for a combat to designate goals and give rise to new values, etc. Wherever they implant themselves on the planet, these efforts are present and tied to one another. They all demand coordinated action because it is their spirit and their flesh, collective struggles in order to ameliorate institutions and organize societies. It is moral, and we must qualify that, but it is in no way a moralism. The more or less conscious illusion, the pride and hypocrisy of those who pretend to bring a morality to human beings without addressing or attending to the material conditions necessary for a truly human life. So, you know, Friedman is very concerned with simply offering people, especially people who are oppressed, suffering in a state of injustice, mere moral injunctions. And obviously those kinds of platitudes are undesirable, but there is a deeper problem here, which I think is essentially what I refer to as I define these, I kind of reconstruct these definitions, moralism as a reduction of the systemic and the material nature of political life to the aggregation or the mere aggregation of the ethical self-formation and the moral lives of individuals. It's essentially to say that, it's a politics of the self that, as Hadot would put it, focuses far too much on the self, makes the individual and sort of individual comportment or behavior far more, gives it a lot more credit than it can really take. And this may sound, I mean, the way I put it may sound like a caricature, but you can find examples of this sort of politics all over the place. Again, in the US, there's a famous statement by Supreme Court, conservative Supreme Court Justice John Roberts from a few years ago, who's talking about issues around racial justice and so on, basically says the way to stop discrimination on race based on race is to simply stop discriminating based on race. And so that puts the onus on individuals to sort of just be, friendly to one another in a way that they certainly aren't, but it completely ignores the systematic nature of, again, racism in the United States or other systemic material and political forms of injustice that, to, as some people put it, have lives of their own beyond individual attitudes and so on. And I can say I'm in Chicago right now. I can show you how systematic racism is just baked into the geography of the city. It's very much not an issue of simply moral reform, right? But that view exists. So anyway, I also kind of borrow a term from Friedman here and define spiritualism as more of the ethical counterpart. Excuse me. It's characterized by an egoistic relationship to oneself that then precludes robust ethical relations with the other and possibly liberatory political relationships with others. And again, this is something we can find in lots of popular spiritualism, right? I think a lot of times we think, oh, like pop spiritualism is it's aesthetically uncomfortable or something, and that's not the important thing. The important thing is that it may be a kind of egoism. It also might not be, right? And that raises interesting questions for how we respond to certain things. I mean, there could be interesting things going on in yoga studios, but if we sort of just assume that it's all, we kind of can tell it by, just by what it looks like, we might miss something important. And so the question for me, right, is how do we articulate a politics of self-transformation or spiritual exercises in a way that doesn't simply amount to moralism? And I think going back to Foucault, and this is sort of one of the core arguments of my book, which again, maybe for this audience is obvious, but I think is less so for many people, including sort of negative readers of people like Foucault. I believe that the relationship of the self to itself is not immediate. It is a circuit that passes through institutions, discourses, practices, material and economic conditions, and so on. And so the question becomes, how is an intervention on the level of who one is at once an intervention into these kinds of political and institutional relations, and vice versa. And I think that for someone like Foucault, I don't know that he really puts this together, but I think it's quite clear from his work, right? So what he says in the 1970s, he's so concerned with institutions, and then the concern with the self. I don't see those things as being a break. I think that I see them as being in continuity. So I kind of wish he had spelled it out a little more in terms of that side of things. So now, with that out of the way, I'm going to move to MLK and to these other themes. So one of the things I find really fascinating and exciting in someone like King, there are many things, and again, if you haven't read his actual writing, please do. The Letter from Birmingham Jail is I think, a profound philosophical text in the Socratic, in a very Platonic tradition, among other things. And again, I think that it's not always clear what the level of familiarity with some of these things are, especially when we're talking to international audience. So if I mention something as if you're supposed to just know what I'm talking about, please stop me and say I don't know that text. Happy to do that. Anyway, so in King's letter that he writes from prison in 1963, where he wrote this on, I have a photo of the original. It's some stationery from like a construction company, which I think is delightful. He invokes this idea of political self-purification. And I think this concept might be one place where a really generative locus of the kind of thing I'm looking for we might be found, right? And I'm going to skip some of this, but I'll say something real quick. So he says at the very beginning, talking to these kind of hostile detractors that he's writing to, in any nonviolent campaign, there are four basic steps: the collection of facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. And then later on, he talks about how the first two aspects of the failed essentially in Birmingham and in other campaigns he was involved in. This is in Birmingham, Alabama, southern United States in the early 1960s. This is a fight against legal racial segregation on public institutions, just, buses and other things. And there's a long history there. And he says, so as in so many past experiences, our hopes have been blasted and the shadow of deep disappointment settled upon us. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. And obviously, we can talk about paresia and sort of, the paresiastic form of life in this context for sure. Anyway, mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? Now, sorry, in the longer version of this talk, I was going to talk about the prehistory of this concept of self-purification in figures like Bayard Rustin, who was one of King's mentors as well, and back into the Gandhian nonviolent tradition, which is really fascinating. There's an incredible text by this figure, Krishnarao Sridharani, who systematized a lot of Gandhian principles and this book was very influential in the US and I believe in the UK to some extent. And we find a much more complex formulation of these. King had 4 points, Rustin had 5. Sridharani has this unbelievably fascinating diagram in the book where self-purification is in there alongside a whole lot of other things. But I won't go into that now. I'm happy to talk about it though. So this concept of self-purification raises a set of questions that I think should be clear. First, what is the self that must be purified? What is it that the self must be purified of? And that's what I'm going to mostly talk about today. How does one do so? How is that process a political one rather than a form of quietism, for example? And how can it be a collective one? we often, and this is one of the things I'm most interested in, we talk about spiritual exercises. They are often, and Hadot emphasizes the communal nature of them, but it's interesting to think about this on a much, much larger scale, a much larger, more collective scale, rather than, say, a small group in the school or something. And again, how can such an intervention, even on the level of a collective self, constitute an intervention into the material, economic, and political conditions that one is faced with? So I'm going to give a passage from one of King's major texts called Stride Toward Freedom, which is his account of the first nonviolent campaign he was involved in, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956. Just as a historical fact, it was ghostwritten with Bayard Rustin, who had a long history of experience with this stuff. But this is one of the passages that we see. So at the end of the boycott, which had gone on for over a year, so this was a year of plus of people, not riding buses, walking miles and miles every day to work, organizing constantly, going to mass meetings every week. It was just seemed like, it's hard to sort of put into words. So the Supreme Court of the United States hears the case. It's called Browder versus Gale. And they judge in favor of the boycotters and say, yeah, segregation is illegal. You can't do this, And so after the announcement of the verdict and before the sort of essentially the state arrives to enforce it, there's backlash from the city of Montgomery and racist sort of vigilantes. People will know the Ku Klux Klan. So once the night that the verdict was handed down, King reports the following. So that night, the Ku Klux Klan rode. The radio had announced their plan to demonstrate throughout the Negro community, and threats of violence and new bombings were in the air. King's own home had been bombed. Children were killed. I mean, absolutely horrible. My mail was warning that if you allow I will not say that word, to go back on the buses and sit in the front seats, we're going to burn down 50 houses in one night, including yours. And another letter cursed the Supreme Court and that damn Hugo Black, who was one of the justices. When he comes to Alabama, we're going to hang you and him from the same tree. And so King says, ordinarily, threats of Klan violence were a signal to the Black community to go into their houses, close the doors, pull the shades, or turn off the lights. Fearing death, they played dead, but this time they had prepared a surprise. When the Klan arrived, according to the newspapers, about 40 carloads of robed and hooded members. Porch lights were on and doors open. As the Klan drove by, Negroes behaved as though they were watching a circus parade. Concealing the effort that it cost them, many walked about as usual. Some simply watched from their steps, and a few waved at the passing cars. After a few blocks, the Klan, nonplussed, turned off into a side street and disappeared into the night. So this is an unbelievable passage. I mean, imagining this, especially in this context, is quite striking, right? If you don't know the history of the Ku Klux Klan, it is basically a white supremacist terrorist organization, emerged in the late 19th century in the U.S. and famously, would murder Black people in broad daylight and so on, and is in fact still active in many ways. Anyway, but my argument here, right, what this looks like is a group of people in the community who are now emboldened by the Supreme Court decision. So we won a victory. We don't have to be afraid of these people anymore. But my argument in the book is, in some sense, the opposite. The victory is not the cause, the origin of the courage and the sort of tactic we see here in the face of the Klan's threat. So instead, the relationship of courage and strategic insight and so much else that we see in King's description of this happened in late November of 1956, they're in fact the conditions of the legal victory. So they evince a fundamentally collective form of self-transformation brought about by the political spiritual exercise of the boycott itself, taken as a whole, which served to both strategically and morally undermine forms of strategic dehumanization tied directly to the material immiseration of the Black community in Montgomery. Now, excuse me. Here, on the level of a collective self, we have an intervention on some aspect of a form of systematic dispossession that is actually necessary for the latter to function. So there's a theme of kind of strategic dehumanization that I'm going to talk about. And so organizing, the boycott itself, can be kind of seen as a paradigmatic form of political spiritual exercise. So I'm going to shift now to talk about this figure, Howard Thurman, who, and I'm going to just essentially, this is the part where I'll read a paper. So, I'll try to keep it brief and exciting. And I think a lot of the strategic and also philosophical and moral psychological things that we see in action in cases like this were articulated or theorized, though I wouldn't get, by a figure like Thurman, and were very much directly implemented. Now, I don't want to make the claim, and I don't in the book, that this was a sort of top-down thing. I think one of the most important things is that you have these theoretical insights and so on that people like Thurman and King generate on their own, get from figures like Augustine and Gandhi and so on, and they themselves are also talking from their own experience, which I'll talk about. But the nature of the movement is very it's not, I wouldn't say it's like acephalous, but there is it's very ground up, right? It's a very much a grassroots movement with the sort of rank and file democratically participating in really important ways. So Howard Thurman, give you a little bit of background. So he was born in 1899. He was raised primarily by his grandmother, who had been a slave, and that was unbelievably important. He serves as this kind of patron intellectual to the long civil rights era, and he was a classmate of Martin Luther King Sr. and a friend. He became one of King Jr.'s most direct and formative mentors. MLK was stabbed at a book signing, and he ended up convalescing with Thurman for quite a while. And Thurman was central to introducing Gandhian nonviolence to the American context. He actually met Gandhi in person in 1936 during what was called the Pilgrimage of Friendship, along with his wife, who was Sue Bailey, who was also an amazing figure. He also joined the National Council of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1925, which was the most important pacifist organization in the US and the UK, beginning around World War I. Excuse me. And he had a lot of influence on other people in this movement, like Rustin and others. So in 1949, pretty well into his career, Thurman publishes this book called Jesus and the Disinherited. And it's a landmark. It's the book King said he had in his pocket at all times. It's a slim volume, but it's very interesting because it can be read as a series of extended meditations on what I call a set of political emotions. And it opens with an introductory chapter laying out his sort of views on Christianity. And again, it's very much a Protestant American, African American Protestant book, but Thurman is a very ecumenical figure, and he's very interested in sort of the history of philosophy and ecumenical dialogue and interreligious dialogue. So I think we can understand the sort of religious commitments, but also not necessarily be beholden to them. So it opens in this chapter kind of describing his approach to Christianity, the figure of Jesus, who he generally attributes a lot of his insights to Jesus. I don't think these are insights that come from Jesus at all. I think they obviously come from him, but I don't think there's a polemical, rhetorical move there. Anyway, the intro is followed by 3 chapters, and each addresses a set of one negative political emotion: fear, deception, hate, respectively. It ends with talking about love, and it speaks directly, I think, to the example from King that I just gave of this event against the Klan. And I take it to be, and I take the example of fear to be really representative here. So I'm just going to talk about the fear chapter, and then that'll be it. So Thurman, and again, Thurman is very much speaking from his own experience. He grew up raised by someone who had actually been a slave, and obviously faced all kinds of racist discrimination and worse in his life as a Black person in the United States. But he describes fear as follows. It is one of the ever-present hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the poor, the economically and socially insecure, and the disinherited. This ever-presence is one of its primary features. A lingering unease, like a climate closing in. He says fear is like the fog in San Francisco or London. It's nowhere in particular and everywhere. It's a mood which one carries around with himself, distilled from the acrid conflict with which his days are surrounded. And for Thurman, both the origin and the nature of this experience is found in relations of power. It has its roots deep in the heart, quote, it has its roots deep in the heart of the relations between the weak and the strong, between the controllers of the environment and those who are controlled by it. And more specifically, it's rooted in relations of violence. So he links this perpetual fear to what he calls the varied dimensions of perpetual violence to which the disinherited are constantly exposed, which produces what he calls a sense of isolation and helplessness. And as he says further, violence, precipitate and stark, is the sire of fear. It is spawned by the perpetual threat of violence everywhere. And there are a series of forces at play here. Always back of the threat is the rumor that the fact that somewhere, under some similar circumstances, violence was used. That's all that's necessary. The threat becomes the effective instrument. The threat is rooted in a past experience, actual or reported, which tends to guarantee the present reaction of fear, and such is the terrorism of the powerful, even as this power is never solely exercised by some designated authority. I think you can hear a lot of resonances with Foucault in this analysis, personally. Maybe I just have too much Foucault on the brain, but I think this is an interesting dialogue. Instead, quote, every member of the controllers group is in a sense a special deputy authorized to enforce a pattern, even when any actual benefit to these special deputies is hard to discern. Even the built environment may play a role. And he is specifically talking about segregation in the United States. So the physical world, right, is the way that the environment is constructed is so much a part of this. And we can think of many, many other examples. Real concrete violence is enacted, which in turn produces a threat that need not be carried out again, or even persistently, though it often is, in order to produce the encroaching fog that Thurman describes. Quote, the anticipation of possible violence makes it very difficult for any escape from the pattern to be effective. Now, among the interwoven themes of the book, Thurman also emphasizes the question of survival, and I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of the analysis. In his words, there is one overmastering problem that the socially and politically disinherited always face. Under what terms is survival possible? The question of survival provides the foundation for his further arguments on liberatory political transformation, including the most important decision faced by the disinherited in all cases, to resist or not to resist. And he defines resistance as the physical overt expression of an inner attitude. And the text further considers the forms that real resistance can take and many reasons that this inner attitude may or may not manifest in an action at a given historical moment. So Thurman links the problem of survival and resistance directly to these political emotions of fear, deception, and hate. And this is really crucial. It's very easy to misunderstand his project based on these chapter headings. This is because these negative terms are not critiques leveled at the disinherited. They are not meant to point out some kind of moral or political failing, and they are by no means considered unreasonable. They're instead the names and the descriptions of, quote, techniques by which the weak have protected themselves against the strong. And even fear itself is called, quote, a form of life assurance. In other words, so fear, deception, and even hate are technologies of the self and especially powerful technologies of survival. Now, on this picture, fear, like deception and hate, is also at the same time a corrosive mechanism of power and a sensible form of, quote, life assurance. It's a wholly reasonable response to the relations of power in question. And he emphasizes this again and again. The problem is not that the one who experiences fear or deploys protective deception or even feels hate against an oppressor has failed somehow, either morally or politically. The issue is rather that these particular political emotions are both personally and socially corrosive and inherently limited in what they can do strategically. So in Thurman's own words, it's clear then, that this fear, which served originally as a safety device, a kind of protective mechanism for the weak, finally becomes death for the self. The power that saves turns executioner. So here, death refers to everything from physical death to dehumanization and spiritual desiccation, thorough enough to preclude active resistance. And of course, any discussion of death in this context should keep in mind Thurman's Christianity, because the resurrection is in many ways sort of at the heart of this book, and it's a perspective from which, maybe everything that dies someday comes back. So still, the position of the disinherited is always and in all cases precarious. the corrosive effects of fear and despair and the like can eventually consume the subject. The death he describes here, aside from providing time needed to survive, to perhaps engage in the work of liberatory political transformation, um, the they cannot themselves, these concepts cannot themselves transform an oppressive environment or the relationship between the weak and the strong. Fear, hate, deception can provide survival, protection, and time, but they will ultimately destroy, the subject. So for him, these techniques reinforce these relations and allow one to survive within them. And that's I think, one of the most interesting parts. Now, the form that this corrosion takes is an integral part of the way that relations of power that Thurman and King describe, the way they're able to function and proliferate. Sorry, I need a glass of water. So for both figures, this dehumanization is not a byproduct, but instead a strategic feature of the relations of power in question. And on Thurman's picture, it's also necessary to understand this dynamic in order to understand and enact the conditions of its transformation. He argues that the experiences of the disinherited, which produce the kinds of protective and corrosive fear and hate and so on, whether segregation, violence, poverty, or the like, operate on the level of the self, soul, the heart, and condition what he calls the inner life. And thus the inner life of the disinherited, and thus determine the possible actions and responses of the disinherited to those very conditions, the conduct of conducts and process of subjection. It's also a process of ongoing dehumanization. And he says the whole experience attacks the fundamental sense of self-respect and personal dignity, without which a man is no man. Further, in an insight that he again attributes to Jesus, which I think is just his own good insight, quote, anyone who, and this is the quote that I provided in the abstract, anyone who permits another to determine the quality of his inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to his destiny. If a man knows precisely what he can do to you or what epithet he can hurl against you in order to make you lose your temper, your equilibrium, and then he can always keep you under subjection. It's a man's reaction to things that determines their ability to exercise power over him. Here again, conduct of conducts, the external environmental production of fear, humiliation, the threat of violence, and so on, all serve to determine the inner life of the disinherited and thereby the outer life of possibility. And it's among the core claims of this book, and again, at the center of his analysis of the material and spiritual degradation faced by the disinherited. And this is, for that reason, the foundation of his understanding of practical resistance and political transformation. And so it's no coincidence, I think, that we see something like this in the overall process within the counteraction that I mentioned above from King against the Klan, against their intimidation. There are strong, very, very good reasons to fear Klan terrorism. And King notes the displays of Klan aggression bring with them the shadow of very, very real and absolutely brutal past violence. And the production of fear and even humiliation are natural products of that. On King's account, that fear tended to produce a certain response prior to the boycott. And for Thurman, the response itself is both reasonable and a tactical goal on the part of those sort of deploying at the Klan and the forces of white supremacy. And as Thurman elaborates and King details, these acts of intimidation are constitutive of a larger strategy of dehumanization and material immiseration. And King, like Rustin and a lot of other people in this literature, very eloquently and describes his own experiences in this way. And I have lots of quotes from King on this, but I'll just read this one from Strength Toward Freedom. He's talking about segregation. He says, as a teenager, I'd never been able to accept the fact of having to go to the back of the bus or sit in the segregated section of a train. The first time I had been seated behind a curtain in a dining car, I felt as if the curtain had been dropped on my selfhood. The very idea of separation did something to my sense of dignity and self-respect. And he has many passages like this. There's a really powerful one that's too long to read from the letter from Birmingham jail, where he describes watching this process happen to his daughter as she sort of comes face to face with the sort of realities of racism and so on in the United States. Anyway, so in Thurman's words, These practices of intimidation and dehumanization are meant to, quote, determine the inner lives of the community in order to control and limit the kinds of reaction and response available to community members, all of which determine the ability to maintain a relationship of economic, social, and spiritual subjection, with the latter playing a role in the former. The reason that in the case that I started with, that, sorry, the Klan chose to enact that display of intimidation following the Supreme Court decision is very simply because it had worked before. It's in concert with an entire history of the kinds of tactics that Thurman describes. It was just the kind of predictable action that had produced the kind of predictable reaction that served to reinforce a relationship of systematic oppression and exploitation in the past. Excuse me. The scene King recounts is striking because on his account, something different now, quote, determines the inner life of the community, as Thurman would put it, and informs the strategy of aggressive public indifference. Now, for Thurman, this kind of resistance is possible because the inward center or inner life of the community have been protected enough in some way to survive until a greater transformation can come about. And though, again, I think that his account allows for even those who have experienced the spiritual death that he describes to, ultimately find their way back. Thurman's specific vision is, again, one he attributes to Jesus, who he says his message focused on the urgency of a radical change in the inner attitude of the people. He recognized fully that out of the heart are the issues of life, and that no external force, however great and overwhelming, can at long last destroy a people if it does not first win the victory of the spirit against them. In this way, he placed his finger on the inward center as the crucial area where the issues would determine the destiny of his people. And for Thurman, the process of transformation begins with something he calls the stabilization of the ego, which results in a new courage, fearlessness, and power. And this stabilization emerges through a fundamental recognition or a reminder or a reinforcement of one's dignity and value. And so that relationship establishes the ground of personal dignity so that a profound sense of personal worth could absorb the fear reaction. This transformed relationship alone is, of course, not enough and has to be built upon. And Thurman is clear that, without it, nothing else is of value. As he describes it, sorry, I'm going to try and finish up here. As he describes it, the first task is to get the self immunized against the most radical results of the threat of violence. When that's accomplished, relaxation takes the place of churning fear. In this way, the fear which determines one's inner life and prevented certain external actions is at least neutralized enough to pursue resistance of whatever kind against the conditions which are the initial source of the fear itself. So the effect of this immunization on what he calls one's inner equipment or the inward center, the inner life, the heart, he has all these terms, is the first step towards active liberation. So for Thurman, the inward center of the dispossessed, which is targeted in relations of power, but it's therefore the heart of possibility of transformation and resistance. So I want to go on for too much longer, but okay. So in Thurman's account in his book, In Jesus and Disinherited, the source of this transformation is a religious realization. The great affirmation that one is a child of God, a point he consistently develops across the book. And on this account, if one understands, for example, that the creator of the universe sees infinite value in you as an individual, that can serve as an inner armor for one's dignity, staving off death just long enough for further transformation to emerge. He reports having witnessed this quite a bit in his own time, but so again, he was very committed to ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. So I don't know that even for him, Christianity is the absolutely necessary condition of this. He didn't go try and convert Gandhi, you know what I mean? And he had a very interesting practice in San Francisco, which we can talk about. Anyway, here's where my reading really departs from his. Not so much because of the religious disagreement, but kind of for formal reasons. This is because I think the account becomes a bit ambiguous at this point. Generally, he consistently describes the point of departure as a revelation through a realization, with the emphasis on a kind of conversion experience. And he's clear that revelation is insufficient for further transformation, though it may be crucial to maintaining the armor of one's selfhood against, forces of dehumanization. What matters to me, I think, is that whatever the particular origin of this collective or self-recognition, He doesn't claim that this moment of conversion is somehow self-sustaining or politically liberatory on his own. As he puts it, even though a man is convinced of his infinite worth, this may not in itself give him the opportunity for self-realization that his spirit demands. Even though he may no longer feel himself threatened by violence, the individual must still reckon with the external facts of his environment, especially those that constrict his freedom. And he talks about you still need to be able to have a job and live without violence and so on. It's one moment, however decisive in an ongoing process. Anyway, where was I? So here's where I will wrap up. In this section on fear, he goes on to briefly reference a role for ongoing cultivation, which he conceptualizes within this context of talking about the stabilization of the ego. He says, if a man's ego has been stabilized, resulting in a sure grounding of his sense of personal worth and dignity, then he is in a position to appraise his own intrinsic powers, gifts, abilities, and talents. He no longer views this inner equipment through the darkened lens of those who are largely responsible for his social predicament. He can think of himself with some measure of detachment from the shackles of his immediate world. And then he says, if he equips himself in terms of training in this mood, his real ability is brought into play. Now, for me, the question is, what does this training in this mood consist in? This is where I think the practices part of it really comes in. What is it and what might it be, right? How is this inner equipment cultivated, either leading up to or beyond this decisive moment of liberatory affirmation of the inward center? So to me, this is where the sort of ambiguity comes in on his account. I think his account is really interesting, especially because I think you can see it in many ways put into practice. But it's also interesting that Thurman himself was an important sort of intellectual figure, but he was never an activist himself. He was a mentor to many activists and so on. And so I think the relationship between this sort of theoretical presentation, which I think the heart of is something that people like MLK and others really affirm, is buttressed and I think further specified by the concrete practices that we see within a lot of these nonviolent movements. So, all this is to say that even when these virtues are present, they have to be cultivated. They require a training in this mood. And I think that under specified training can be understood essentially through this concept of self-purification that King invokes in his letter, and other people do as well. And the question, of course, is what that training looks like. And I have a photo here of, I think, one of the great American Parisists, Rosa Parks, and I'll just end with this, right? In different nonviolent campaigns, it's important to understand that the specific practices, so, and Hadot and Foucault talk about this, right? There's the telos, and the sort of practices themselves are, and the conditions under which one practices all are in complex dialogue. The specific practices that were taken up can be read in many cases to respond directly to strategies of dehumanization, subjection, or fear among many other conditions. And these kind of fall into at least two broad categories in practice. Some exercises consisted in preparatory or training exercises. So you had in Montgomery and elsewhere the nonviolent workshop that people like Rustin, but also a figure called Glenn Smiley would lead. And the practices that Glenn Smiley describes are absolutely fascinating if you read them in terms of, and he was a minister, he was a white minister, very interesting person. If you read them as spiritual exercises, they're very, very interesting. And then the others, and this is one of the tensions I'm interested in, or the complexities, consisted in the protest practices themselves. So people started talking about, in Montgomery, walking to work for a year took on a religious significance. It became a kind of pilgrimage rather than a hardship. And the transformation of one's relationship to that was absolutely fundamental. I mean, the city just thought, these people will get tired and bored and they won't want to do this anymore. But it actually took on different meaning and kind of ended up being a practice of the self that was very, very rich, and the accounts of it are quite moving, and so on. So they all required a radical transformation of daily life and a fundamental reorientation of the relationship of the self to itself in order to be successful and to bring about, and I say successful in the case of Montgomery, at least because the immediate goal was to win a Supreme Court case and desegregate the local bus system. And on its own terms, it was a very big success. It was a huge success. It did not dismantle systematic racism either in the US or elsewhere, but it achieved an immediate goal through in this way. So I'm going to leave it there. And there's more to say, and I'm happy to talk about it, but I don't want to take up any more talking time. So thank you all, and I'm excited to, chat.
Daniel, many thanks for this very thorough, interesting, and thought-provoking talk. I think you have raised a very important and challenging issue in the whole debate around philosophy as a way of life, which is the potentiality that this conception of philosophy and ethics might have or not have in our political challenging world. And it was really nice also to have the presence of Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman, figures that are not so often brought to this kind of debate. So thank you also for that. We now have 35 minutes for discussion. The floor is now open to everybody who wants to intervene, make questions, suggestions, criticisms, whatever. Helder.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this presentation. It was very stimulating to see how you applied Hadot's and Foucault's ideas. It was the many intersections you pointed towards were very convincing, and they seem to be open to very fruitful development. So I'm looking forward to see how you further tackle these issues in the book. I have two questions that concern apparent differences or apparent points of distance between what Hadot and Foucault say and what you presented. And I was interested in seeing what you think about them and if they are actually closer than what they seem to me after hearing your presentation in these particular points. So the first point concerns the question of survival and the question of dignity. So I thought about many texts in antiquity to which Foucault and Hadot often refer, where we have this distinction between survival and good life, and the concern with survival and the concern with good life. And the concern with dignity seems to be for me at least, a third element. So one needs survival, one needs dignity or some kind of recognition, and one still needs then what the ancient philosophers thought as good life, a meaningful life, a full realization of the human being. That seems to be a further layer. And much of what you said was focused on survival and dignity. So I was wondering if there isn't a distance here, because this came to me, especially when we were talking about the urgency of direct action, in contrast with the preparation, preparation. It seems to me that in many cases, direct action is too urgent, something that we must implement so immediately that it might be incompatible with the kind of self-transformation, the ethical self-transformation involved in ancient ethical projects and in many philosophical projects. So there might be some conflicts here or some point of conflict. And the second question is somewhat related with this, or with the idea of good life that seemed to be present here, that seemed to be in very close connection with religion. And this brought to my mind the question of whether we can simply merge together philosophy and religion and see what they have in common in this spiritual dimension, or whether there is actually a very significant difference, because all the aspects of philosophical concepts, philosophical discourse, philosophical reason, philosophical argument seem to be absent from your presentation and seem to allow for a more religious interpretation of the spirituality. So I was wondering if you also see this difference, if you also try to tackle this objection. So I'm thinking more about these objections by Cooper, Nussbaum, and others, that Hadot and Foucault have blurred the lines between philosophy and religion, and we can show that in Hadot and Foucault, there are still many elements that are not simply religious. And I was wondering if you can also find that here, or if this is a moot point and not very relevant for what you are trying to develop.
Thank you so much. Those are unbelievably good questions. Thank you. And they're really generative, and I appreciate them. They're things I think about quite a bit. So I want to start with the first one. And I think this is really interesting. And I think that for me, at least, philosophy is a way of life, and these figures as well, just the people like Foucault and Hadot, but also figures like MLK and so on. I think one of the things they really do, and this is something I'm very interested in, is put a lot of pressure on a lot of these traditional conceptions, right, of what it means to lead a good life, right? And so how can one, and this is the question of essentially quietism, right, that we saw in the beginning. How is it, I agree that the unexamined life is not worth living, right? But when we ask what is justice, it's always, I think, for many people, a bit ironic to ask what justice is when there are slaves standing around you, and things like that. And so, in a case like ours, maybe someday, right, we will be able to hunt in the morning and fish in the afternoon and be a critical critic in the evening. But in the world that we live in and have lived in, even for the ancients, I think a lot of, I personally, I mean, this is my personal view, I think it's a shame in a way that the practical nature of these questions hasn't put more pressure on our conceptions of the good life and so on. I see no other option. Just looking at the world around me that I live in, and I'm a very lucky person, but I can't possibly think of a good life without a life that does seriously consider and even actively pursue questions of justice and so on. And so that, I don't know if that helps, but I love this question of urgency because it's so interesting, right? And I love it because in a way it's also a practical question. I think a figure like King was also a very contemplative person. And I mean, you can very, very versed in history of philosophy and theology. I mean, you can see Stanford has all of his papers now, and you can see his notes on Plato. And so much clear contemplative work was going on. And there is this sense of what is the relationship between the urgency, right, of direct action and the sort of, I don't want to say buttress or something, or the scaffolding of contemplation. I don't know if that helps. It's, I think some people, at least, I mean, I think maybe, clearly we all, I don't want to say need a break, right? But I think that it might be, for this framework, right, it might be interesting to start asking, how is it that these urgent needs, right, these urgent practices can challenge and help us reimagine philosophical forms of life, right? And that's sort of what I'm interested in. And this is, I think this in a way speaks to some of the questions that maybe come up in the second one, which is, this isn't how we normally think of philosophy. And, obviously when Foucault ends his career with Diogenes, that throws a lot of people off, I guess, and I mean, I have critiques of Diogenes, to be honest with you. He's very funny, but to what extent are Diogenes's sort of antics like an intervention into the actual social fabric of Athenian society? Is he's absolutely funny, millennia later, but what is the nature of the critique, and is it a critique on a systemic level, which is kind of, again, there are other people haunting this conversation, as I'm sure you can tell, and I don't know, I with the critiques of someone like Hadot, I mean, I'm thinking of the cases where, sorry, does that answer the first question? Because I love that question and I want to keep talking about it, but okay, I don't want to take forever, and we can continue. I have a PhD in religious studies. I have to say I have no idea what religion is. So, which raises other interesting questions and so on. I'm also interested in maybe not saying this, say, religious tradition or something is in fact really philosophy, but that maybe some of those cases are doing philosophical things and we can treat them philosophically. I'm interested in, I mean, I find it amusing and great that the Peter Adamson, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast, if you've listened to that, I'm on board with the way he imagines philosophy, as like everything, like so much systematic thought that has happened in so many cases. So I quite like that. I also think that some of the critiques of some of the folks you mentioned of Hadot are sort of unfair because they try to say Hadot doesn't care about philosophical dialogue, and Hadot very clearly cares about philosophical dialogue and contemplative philosophical practice. The stuff that's been translated into English makes it seem like he's not, which I think is a little bit telling as far as those critiques go. But we can talk about that. But if insofar as bringing a practical and active, a practicing concern with justice that I think we can think of as a philosophical practice, at least if we follow Hadot and Foucault, into philosophical conversation in a way that challenges what we traditionally think of as philosophical practice or and so on. And if that seems like some of that is religious, we'll bring that into philosophy, then I'm all for it. I guess I don't know if that answers the question, but I don't know. Sounds good to me. I also went to, when I was an undergraduate, I went to Rutgers University, which is a very, very famously analytic philosophy department. And so to me, anything that challenges that conception of philosophy, I have a personal and intellectual stake in. I hope that helps. I hope that.
Yeah, it helps a lot, and I agree with you. There are much more similarities between philosophy and religion that is often admitted, especially when people are very concerned with this distinction between philosophy and religion, as if it were a very bad thing to be religious in some way or to have something in common with religion. So I find your point very convincing.
Or even to not be religious, but find value in religious thought, or religious
Exactly.
life. It's absolutely fine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have another question by Pedro Dotto.
All right. Thank you, Daniel, very much for this very fascinating presentation. I didn't know many of the political and philosophical figures that you mentioned in your talk, even Howard Thurman. So thank you for bringing it to my attention. Very, very interesting, very provoking character. And for this focus on U.S. history, the history of political activism in the United States. So I have a question, which is, as I understood it, this presentation of yours is directly extracted from a chapter from this book of yours that that will be published soon, I hope, The Care of the Self and the Other, in the Care of the Other. And I would like to know, how does this presentation today relates to your main argument in the book on the care of the self and the care of the other? And how do you conceive of this relationship between the care of the self and the care of the other? If there is any priority in this pair, if what comes first, or if it is a more dynamical kind of interlinked relationship between the care of the self and the care of the other, politics and ethics, or is it possible to conceive of an ethics without a politics, or a politics without an ethics, from your proposition of bringing together care of the self and care of the other? A side question, maybe, if you want to touch on it, if you trace this back, the theme of the care of the other, which is not very explored by Foucault and even Hadot, but especially Foucault, if you extract and explore this line of thinking on the care of the other in Foucault's own writing, and where do you locate it in Foucault's own writing, presentations, or even maybe his political activism? And just a final question: if in your book, on this question on the care of the self, care of the other, if you make use of Foucault's concept of psychagogy, as it shows only twice in his oeuvre, in the hermeneutics of the subject and the government of the self and of the other, this conduction of soul, the leading of souls. If you make use of it in thinking about these problems, thinking through these problems and this relationship between the care of the self and the care of the other, that's basically my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pedro. These are wonderful questions as well, and they also speak directly to some of the main themes of the book, which I hope I'll, Wendy from Colombia is here, so, the book is almost done, I swear. Just, so it's quite a lot. So the first thing I will say is that I am interested in how we might understand, and in some ways I take this question a bit from Foucault, a bit from George Friedman himself and a few others. How might we actually really understand ethics, understood as the sort of transformation of oneself, just very, very generally, rather than just morality, right? And politics, insofar as we think of it as, say, the transformation of and maintenance of material conditions and economic conditions and so on, something on the systematic level, as something that is really integrated and dynamic, as you say, without simply reducing one to the other. So I think my goal, I think it's possible to be a reductionist. I think it's possible to reduce the political to the ethical, and in some ways to reduce the ethical to the political. I think people do this in real life all the time. The reduction of politics to ethics, at least where I'm from, is way more present. We constantly, and again, I won't speak to I know that the political situation, like everywhere, is absolutely crazy right now. So, I mean, it's all crazy and similar in different ways, but we often in the US constantly are being scolded about our morality and are being told that, what do you care about whether the train, we need, I don't know, how good the trains are or something, you just need to be moral, and parents need to be better and all this other stuff, and oh, we can have guns everywhere. It's just about personal morality, right? If someone shoots someone, it's just because they were bad, right? And it's this kind of thing. I do think you get this, and I don't talk about this that much in the book because I actually think it's less of a problem. But there's at least a conceptual foil to this, which Friedman calls the Marxism naïf of his own youth, right? And I don't want to get too much, I refer to this a little bit as a kind of naive materialism. You might see this as a bit of some people call class reductionism or something like that. But and I don't know, I think I know some like very, you might call ultra leftists or something, or people like that who simply believe that creating a just political system will somehow just diffuse into sort of moral behavior. And the thing is, I talk about this a little bit, and I don't think these are exactly parallel, because I do agree with Friedman and with Marx and so on that, and others, we could talk about what Marx thinks some other time, but that it is simply true that the maintenance of basic, material conditions and needs will have some effect on, the lack of scarcity will have some effect on our individual relationships and so on, though I don't think it's fully determinative. And I'm not as interested in whether or not there are really people who think that it is. For Friedman, he basically says, I thought this when I was 25, and we can probably find plenty of 25-year-olds that think that, and he says, I don't think that anymore. But it's an interesting kind of it's a useful concept in that way. But my interest is in how do we actually talk about these things together? And I want to avoid simply saying that, oh, we just need to all transform ourselves and then the world will transform. Certainly that will happen, but it misses the systematic and the material parts. So this is why I'm interested in, and a lot of the book is taken to set this problem up. So I begin with every chapter is sort of on somebody different. I begin with Pierre Hadot. I talk about George Friedman for a really long time. And then I talk about Foucault. And then I kind of culminate with King. And I think one of the things that this literature, this civil rights literature and the tradition of nonviolence at least gives me is a lot of material that actually serves as a corrective and fills in certain gaps in the sort of philosophical literature. And I think this is in some ways related to your second question, where I think Foucault gives me so many theoretical resources, but I don't know that he really talks about the care of the other as much as I would like. There are And this is I actually so I had this whole section that I just removed from the book, and I'm just going to make it its own paper, and I'm going to present it at a conference later this year called Foucault's Lost Concepts, because there is all this issue of psychagogy. He has these concept of revolutionary subjectivity. He talks about the political spirituality in the Iranian context. These are really interesting concepts that I think actually he mentions revolutionary subjectivity like twice also in hermeneutics and I think elsewhere, and that's sort of it. He says somebody should do this genealogy. Now I'm going to get back to talking about the church fathers for hundreds of pages. I'm like, but I don't, I can't tell him what to do. But I wanted the revolutionary subjectivity. That's what I wanted. You know what I mean? And I think that would be a really interesting case where he would then be able to talk about the care of the other and the care of the self in this really interesting political way. But I think that this might go back to Foucault's sort of uh, not wanting to be super normative for various reasons that he sort of outlines in places that are hard to find. But yeah. So all that is to say, I like to think of this relationship as dynamic, and I'm trying to find cases where they are. I feel like Foucault, he gives me the hint of some things that I'd really like, and then maybe it's just up to us, to think about them. And the psychagogy example is actually in that same category. Does that help?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. But just to insist, are you going to, do you plan of using such a concept in your book? Do you find it useful to think through this relationship between the care of the self or the care of the other, or you just left it for the conference paper?
The psychagogy is going to be for the conference paper. The book is way too long. So I've been in a bit of really trying to pare it down. And and also, like you said, I think it's such an interesting concept, and there's so little, and because there's so little about it, it means there's a lot to possibly explore. And I think it would end up being a bit too much of a digression.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions in the audience? Does somebody want to? Yeah, Alex?
Okay.
If somebody wants to speak next, please raise your hand virtually. Alex,
May I?
please.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for this great presentation. It was quite interesting. I was wondering if regarding the formation or regarding the training, like a spiritual exercise, such as this non-violence workshop, as it told, was it related to a Black theology agenda, or it is a broad environment that could be called spiritual exercise, bringing together different movements or even theologies? What comes first? This movement that we're talking, spiritual exercise, or the Black theology agenda, or is possible to talk what comes first or not?
So can you say the last thing again? The last little bit of the question.
Yeah, I was thinking about this when you told us about the training of spiritual exercise, and you told about the non-violence workshop. It was related to a Black theology agenda, or it comes from a broad environment that could be called a spiritual exercise, and this environment bringing together different movements, social movements, or even theology like Black theology or theological liberation, for instance.
Yeah. So historically, it's the latter. It's not initially rooted in sort of Black theology. What's interesting is, and I think this is interesting philosophically as well. So in practice, there is this just in reality, there was an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, FOR, which still exists, but was an organization that emerged in the UK actually as an anti-war organization to protest the First World War, of all things, and becomes this major center for nonviolence. And one of the reasons I'm interested in nonviolence is because it has this very interesting relationship to sort of discipline and training and so on, and so this is drawing from many different traditions. It's drawing from some 19th century spiritualist traditions. It's drawing from Quakerism, which is quite interesting as a movement. Again, Quakerism was a pretty major religious force in the US and the UK in a few centuries ago, but is this very small minority, I think, in both of those places now, but has a historical pacifist perspective. And interestingly, you know, the history is even more complicated because the Quakers were major abolitionists in both the U.S. and the U.K. So there's a concern with racial justice there that's sort of already there, and the Gandhian tradition. So, which you find, and Gandhi himself is such an interesting figure intellectually. He's educated in the UK. He's very influenced by certain kinds of 19th century kind of pacifism and so on, but he's also drawing very directly on Indian sources, Indian philosophical sources, and he's quite well versed in them as well. And so once you do get a sort of intervention by Black theology and that tradition, and that definitely informs and reshapes these practices and so on, and it gives them different, you know, some new, and I think in some ways, for practical reasons, relatable theological premises for a lot of the rank and file who are participating. But at the same time, King talks about how in Montgomery, within the year, you have an entire African-American community using all these like Sanskrit words, like satyagraha and so on. So it's always a kind of interreligious, intercultural, and I think, you know, multi-perspectival movement. And the practices, these nonviolent workshops, were sometimes, you know, were original to a given movement, but others, like Baird Rustin, who I mentioned before, and Glenn Smiley. Rustin was Black and Quaker and also queer. He was an out gay man in the 1930s, which caused him all kinds of problems. It was very interesting. Gay, Black. He had organized with the Communist Party. You know, this basically did everything that would get you in trouble in the United States at that time. But Smiley was a white Methodist minister, and they came and they had a training program, and they adapted it, you know, but they used some pretty classic Gandhian techniques. So one of the first things they did in Montgomery to kind of throw the city off, which I think was an amazing practice, there were arrest warrants out for 150 Black activists. So they just all turned themselves in at once. And, you know, they all went down to the jail, and, you know, it just kind of threw off just a transformation of an attitude towards a pretty standard threat, and then, you know, so on. So I don't know, does that answer the full question? Just on a historical level, I do think it's much more interdisciplinary. I don't know, many perspectives coming together and they change, of course, based on the conditions and so on.
Thank you. I know that Misko Vandovitz also wants to intervene.
Yes, thank you. Am I heard now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this lecture. I'm sorry I didn't use the Zoom before. So
no problem.
I'm very happy that Eli said me about these meetings. I'm quite not familiar with that. So again, thank you very much for this lecture. I have a feeling that I'm not being seen to, but I hope this is not a big problem. Two issues came to my mind. First, I understand that Martin Luther King in particular, was aware that his life was at risk more than the life of the average person. But did they, Martin Luther King or Thurman, saw in such a threat a value other than pride, dignity, or political and social gain? Did they perceive that the very awareness of death hiding just behind their backs, regardless of the context, made their lives spiritually and philosophically richer than life of people who do not see, who don't contemplate that threat every day? And secondly, it's more reflection than question. I have this thought. I suspect that if I had to stand at the back of a bus because of my skin color, I would feel terrible. But maybe that means I'm a bad philosopher, that I don't life past it all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These are such good questions. And the first one I think is very interesting regarding the relationship toward death, because obviously, as we all know, this is such a core theme in the ancient philosophical context for the Stoics and for so many, and it's a key theme that Hadot is so interested in. And I think it's fascinating because on the one hand, on some level, right, King's life was certainly more at risk than say someone like Thurman or some other people. And in fact, he was assassinated, and there was an attempt on his life earlier on. So a woman came up to him while he was doing a book signing and stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener, and he almost died then. This was in the 60s, so before he was actually killed. And so I do think he had this very profound sense of, sort of being towards death. And I think it did inform what he's doing. And if you read some of his speeches, it's almost uncanny. So the day before he's murdered, he gives this speech. It's called the Mountaintop Speech. And he makes reference to, Moses and seeing the promised land and not knowing he's not going to get there. It seems very, very self-aware. At the same time, one of the reasons I think this literature is interesting is that insofar as we are talking about Black Americans in at least the early 20th century, and frankly to this day, death is an ever-present fact. And Thurman himself lived to be very old, and he had a rich life. But again, he was raised by a grandmother who had been an actual slave and had had many acts of violence taken against him and seen so much violence. And so the fact of the presence of violence and death very much, and I think in this book and in his other writings, it completely informs everything he's thinking about and doing. So maybe once King is sort of hurled into more of a public, space, and he's well known and so on, there might be a bit more urgency there. But I think it's interesting that it's hard to even read any of this literature without this concern for death informing it in the background. And on the second point, it's interesting when you talk about being forced to stand in the back of the bus and so on. It's really powerful and painful to read a lot of the accounts of people in this case, and you can read this in accounts of other people who are in states of sort of systemic and other exceptional states of oppression, what it does to you psychologically, because and Thurman talks about this, like the role of fear and violence, right? And so there were many people who attempted to not sit on the back of the bus and not follow this rule. Some of those people were arrested, some of them were beaten mercilessly. And so when you're already in a state of economic and political compromise, let's say, and you just need to get to work, I think Thurman would say it's completely intelligible. I mean, it's tragic and it's awful and it's dehumanizing, but it is intelligible that one would just say, I just need to get to work today. I'm going to deal with this. And I think for them, I think this is an important point because it's how it works, right? That's how that's able to continue, right? There's essentially a cost-benefit analysis of one's dignity that happens here, and it's sort of horrible, but it's part of the functioning, right? I think for King and Thurman and others in this context, they really genuinely see exactly that experience as being how this broader sort of political persecution essentially operates. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Thanks so much. We are now running out of time, almost at the end of our session. I also had a very short clarification question, which is somehow a follow-up of the answers you already gave to Elder and Pedro. I was just wondering if your talk and your whole book, your work on this subject is meant as a criticism of Hadot and Foucault and as a consequence of ancient philosophical ethics, or if you are somehow trying to develop a topic that is underdeveloped in Hadot's and Foucault's accounts. Because normally, or the common depiction of ancient philosophy is really as a kind of egoistic moralism, as you also described it, not in connection with ancient philosophy, but I think that's one of the most common depictions of ancient ethics, especially during the Hellenistic period. What you said about Diogenes could easily apply probably to a Stoic or Epicurean. It seems that they were not so much concerned with ending slavery than how to be happy or lead a good life, even being a slave, or not to end poverty, but learning not to value wealth and so on. So do you, is this, are you trying to correct those and Foucault's accounts, or at the same time, it seems to be not so fair to exclude any political concern from ancient ethics, and there have been attempts to correct this and point to the political dimension also, or this care of the other, which is also implied in the care of the self and so on. So do you think this political concern is somehow implied already in ancient ethics and also in Hadot's and Foucault's accounts, or do you think this is a deficiency, and in order to make this account useful for today, we need to make this expansion of the model?
So this is a great question, and I say this often in the book. I think that there are very clear limitations and horizons to the work of Foucault, Hadot, Friedman, King. I don't think that that's a bad thing. It is a critique in the strict sense. I think there are limitations here, and I want to talk about them. I say that, I mean, Hadot's work is so it's so extensive, right? The fact that he doesn't eventually, I think he pauses at a very specific point, and I talk about this a bit in the book, and I think that there are some ways where it's actually fascinating, because to me, Friedman picks up right at the limits of Foucault's or Hadot's project. But I think I mean, again, I don't think it's a bad thing that they have limitations. So to put it that way, I'm not saying, aha, they didn't talk about this and therefore their whole project is useless. I don't believe that about anyone. I think we all have limitations, and it's all of our work is limited. And I hope that people take it for what's in it and what it implies and what it can bring to us. And I think it gives us material to work with in a productive way. So I do say, here's where I think a major limit in Hadot's work is. Here's where I think a major limit in Foucault's work is. But I don't say that that's necessarily something wrong. I think it's like, oh, this is great. This is an occasion for further thought and so on. And I would take the ancient philosophers in that way too. I think that there are critiques in that sense in terms of limitations, and I do talk about them. In my chapter on Hadot, I talk about what I take to be the problem of elites, and I imagine that I don't think philosophy belongs to professionals. I think it's something that belongs to everyone. It's just tough when you don't know what that would have looked like for a lot of people. Certainly in the ancient world, we read Marcus Aurelius, but I mean, how many slaves were there in Rome when he was in charge, and he's out conquering people and so on. And I think he's a great philosopher, but also I think, like, let's think about this too, let's consider what this is all like. I think a really interesting case here is Epictetus, obviously, who had been enslaved himself, and there's a fascinating influence of Epictetus on the Haitian revolutionaries, Toussaint Louverture and others, and that's something I'd love to explore more. I know people have written about this, and that's quite fascinating. So, I think that these figures all give us so much, and then there are limitations, and we can take those limitations and go somewhere new with them. And I'm interested. So, for example, you said learning to live with poverty and so on. It's a bit different when that's a choice that you have, and I think it's worth thinking about that. And I'm obviously interested in religion and the history of asceticism, and I agree with Hadot that Christian asceticism can be obviously very rooted in ancient philosophical practice. But I'm also I've invoked Marx a few times here. I'd like to see the good life without the idea that sort of poverty is necessary, right? So does that make sense? I hope that helps.
Total sense. I look forward to reading your book.
Awesome.
In the
Thank you
meantime,
so much.
Thank you so much for this exciting talk and discussion. Thank you, all of you who made questions and contributed for the discussion. We'll come back on March 20 with a talk by Daniele Lorenzini, and hope to meet
Great,
you all
Danielle
again
and
there.
Lorenzini.
So take care. Thank you. And bye.
Thank you, everyone.
See you
I'm so
soon.
grateful. Thank you, Marta. I'm
Thank
profoundly
you.
grateful for this.
Thank you. Bye.